Welcome to the Embodiment podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with embodiment specialists from around the world. I'm your host, Mark Walsh.
So on the show today, Robert MacNaughton. So Robert has been in charge of what's a place called the Integral Center, fascinating place in Boulder. He comes from a background, all kinds of things, educated in Europa, some yoga in there, music, capoeira, trained as an engineer. He's got a bunch of things going on for him. We've been on each other's radars a while. We met up once in Boulder quite a few years ago, but it's been a while, so it's going to be good to catch up. So Robert, welcome back.
Yeah, Mark, this is really great. So good to have a conversation again. I look forward to seeing where we jump into.
Good. We're going to have fun, I think. So let's start at the beginning. How did you get interested in the body?
Well, I mean, like most things, I realized that it was a good thing to be interested in when the rest of my life wasn't working. Like I wanted more attention from the opposite sex. I wanted, to see what was going wrong in my life, if anything was. And apparently the body is a significant factor in how one feels and things like that. But I mean, I think truly it was like, getting in shape, the old why the ads for six-pack abs are still, sell so well is like I wanted to feel better about myself, to look better, and started from kind of a materialist place, and then that led me to a lot of places, and then I took my dive more into the kind of postmodern. No, this isn't about looks. This isn't about those things. This is about how I feel, and that led me to yoga. And the more esoteric traditions and, things with a lot more complicated ideas about it. And so I've been all around the merry-go-round that way I'm embarrassed to say, as a seeker.
Got it. So you grew up whereabouts in the States?
I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, southeast United States, very traditional Southern roots. I went to a prep school that was like all about the football team, and all the energy went that way. It was very competitive. Everything was about kind of like how good you're doing academically and how well you're doing with sports. And frankly, that really turned me off of all things related to competition, which had me move out to Boulder, Colorado.
Okay, Rob, so you moved to Boulder, Colorado, which if listeners don't know, if their innocent ears don't know, is one of the sort of most alternative places in the States, maybe outside of sort of Bay Area. It's pretty up there, right?
Yeah, it's totally, what would be considered quote unquote progressive place. A lot of spiritual seekers. On the plus side, it's a lot of people that care about development. You've got, more PhDs per capita than anywhere in the United States. You got more professional athletes in the kind of like Olympic sports and things like that per capita. You got more psychotherapists. You got more spiritual teachers. It's like a lot of people. There's plenty of people who don't care about like spiritual growth and development, but they care about competition and getting into their bodies and like achieving in a big way. So it's a sexy population. Everybody like wants to get better and improve themselves. So it's very inspiring that way. But on the side, it comes with a lot of, what Boulder is famous for, what we call spiritual materialism, which is like being a materialist about your spirituality, but also anything that's personal growth related. So one day someone's a yoga teacher, the next day they're a Sufi master, the next day they're, into shamanic traditions, and it gets kind of nauseating after a while.
Yeah, I went out there about 4 or 5 years ago for the Buddhist Geeks conference. Had a great time at the conference, hang out. I stayed at Brooke and Rob McNamara's house. Brooke we had on the show, and I had a really good time. There's yoga classes and dance classes, and it's also kind of in nature as well. There's these beautiful kind of mountains all around it. So it's because it's a small town surrounded by kind of natural beauty. It's quite different from being in like the big city somewhere.
Yeah, it's absolutely gorgeous. And, people talk about living in the Boulder bubble because it really is kind of being in an alternate reality that a lot of people can take for granted and start kind of whining about how things aren't, working perfectly with, all the normal things that people whine about, where we're living in one of the most beautiful places in the country, like more sunny days per year than just about anywhere else. It's like a little slice of heaven. We call it the Republic of Boulder sometimes.
Yeah. It seems quite kind of cut off from a lot of other places as well. It's quite hard to get there. And, I do remember, though, the level of sort of somatic stuff, embodiment work. I'd just be like hitting on a random girl in a cafe, and she'd be like, yeah, I'm doing my PhD in somatic psychology at Naropa right now. And, I'm a black belt in this. And, I've done 20 years of yoga. And this was just like random, like people I was bumping into. So it was, let alone at the Integral Center, which we'll come on to. So it's pretty densely populated in terms of somatic practices.
For sure. We're very spoiled. We're really, as any person you're talking to, likely has a lot of training and is dedicated to practice almost at a minimum, which, when I travel to other places and I encounter people that don't even know what the word practice means, it's a bit of a culture shock.
Yeah, and I look at the listener figures for this show, and we have a good chunk of people from San Francisco, Portland, Austin. Byron Bay is the Australian equivalent. Brighton, where I live, is the sort of nearest we come to Britain, small college town by the sea rather than the mountains, but with lots of sort of liberal hippie stuff happening. There's a town in Germany, I forget the name, that's kind of like this. There's Freiburg. And, this is... let's talk a little bit about these like little micro environments of embodiment. Because on the one hand, there's this kind of amazing amount of stuff. Like on any day, like tonight, I'm debating going to one of two great yoga teachers or maybe 5 rhythms. I just had a great massage and I did an Alexander technique workshop yesterday, and that's a normal couple of days for me. So on the one hand, this is great kind of availability of stuff. And I know we've also got listeners in Kazakhstan and Saudi Arabia who are kind of going, fuck, I wish I had that. I have students in Oman and places, or even just like the north of England or Kansas. And actually Kansas City, I think, is pretty good. So on the one hand, there's this kind of huge abundance of stuff. But on the other hand, as you say, people kind of spoil. And it's like, no, that world-class yoga teacher's too far away. I might have to kind of cycle for 20 minutes to get there. So maybe you could speak a little bit more to that kind of dense, places like Boulder that have that density of practice.
Yeah, in a certain sense, it's kind of an occupational environmental hazard of living in a place like this, where we have an embarrassment of riches of opportunities like this. But we take, it's easy to start taking it for granted and even get a little cynical. All the kind of things that come along with elitism, with having abundance. And I can say for myself, running the Integral Center, where I've got like world-class Hatha yoga masters like Sophia Diaz, teaching 15 classes a week, 10 steps away from my office. And like, I go home and watch Netflix,
So here's the thing. I want to come back to the Integral Center and what that is in a bit. And actually, I think this will lead on to it. How do you decide? So, my mum, she just went to the only yoga class in town. There was one Iyengar yoga class where she lived. That was it. She went to that. That was her yoga class. And there wasn't any Aikido or 5 rhythms or anything else. Whereas, you could go to world-class Aikido, 5 rhythms, 10 types of world-class yoga, or you could stay home and watch Netflix. So how do you make that decision? And this is a constant question for myself, but when you live in a town like that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Mark. And this is something I've truly struggled with over the years of like, because it's total decision paralysis. I mean, plenty of people here, make it happen, and you choose your yoga studio. And I think it's a lot about community. Mm-hmm. You got to look at the other aspects of where you're getting involved with. And like, great thing about good yoga studios is they got good culture. You can meet good people. I frankly got nauseated by the yoga community because of just the, certain lack of alignment that people had with actually like walking the talk. Mm-hmm. Or thinking they could tell you about your spirituality, just because they've done a weekend teacher training. And for me, it became much more about getting clear about my specific goals. Like, what am I trying to achieve with my embodiment practice right now? And then doing experiments, based on that, where like I can go check out something like Orange Theory. Have you heard about that?
No, I don't know that. What's Orange Theory?
It's a franchise like fitness studio thing in the United States that's become popular over the past few years, but it's a dialed in system where they're like, okay, we want to get you not into the red zone, but into the orange zone. And it's, strength training and cardio, but it's like specifically designed for fat burning. You like schedule on the website what group class you're going to come to. So it works on accountability, like getting you to class. And it's no special Lineage master or anything like that. It's just a cool tech that happens to work real well.
It's a system that works, and it works for a specific goal. So I want to actually highlight this, because this is both obvious and easy to miss, is that, you know, if you don't have a lot of choice, it's just like, you know what, I'll do the only thing that's in town. What is there, a karate class? Great, I'll do that. It's an embodied practice. And I always say to my students in areas that are a bit cut off, I kind of say, any embodied practice is better than none. And also you can make a lot out of anything. You know, you can pursue different goals within a practice. And then, you know, if we do have that luxury of choice, I think there's a risk in not finding commitment in community. The sort of sweet shop theory that we have in Brighton is, it's very easy to jump around and not have that real depth and accountability and actually, you know, really surrendering to a teacher, committing to something. I think that's a risk. And another one is actually just being like, okay, but what are your specific goals? Because if it's just strength training, I say just, I mean, it's a good goal as any, or fat burning, you know, there's a fitness goal. You might be better off actually just at a regular gym and not with the yoga teacher who speaks fluent Sanskrit, but you're not going to, you know, be doing any cardio.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you know, I remember talking to my dad, and he was like, hey, you know, I just wish I could go to the gym every day. And I was like, you can afford it, hire a personal trainer. And so, you know, now he's got this like ex-professional boxer who shows up with him 3 days a week. And my dad at 70 is benching more than he's ever benched in his whole life. You know, there's like simple things you can do pretty much anywhere you live. And like for me, like the things that work best, what I do now, besides like, you know, go hiking outside every once in a while, but like, I like, you know, Pavel's, you know, simple and sinister kettlebell workout. I don't know if you've tracked that, but you know,
the East European dude, I've heard he's brutal.
Yeah, he's awesome. And I've been, you know, of course it's a hip trendy thing. So I got into it a long time ago, but you know, it's two kettlebell workouts, 100 swings and 10 Turkish get-ups. And I do that, you know, when I want to get really strong. It's super reliable. And I do it in my living room. You know, I can bust it out in a half an hour before I go to bed, you know, when I got a break at lunch or something like that. It's just right here. I know how it works. It's like, I don't have to go anywhere. Or the other thing I've been doing is gymnastics bodies. This teacher, Coach Sumner, and it's an online, you know, video course that like tracks your progress and pivots you to different videos on your progress, you know, of doing simple body and flexibility stuff from a world-class gymnastics teacher. So like little things that are somewhat elusive, obvious, I've found really good mileage for my specific goals. Comparing that to where I do like a deep dive with a teacher, which I think is categorically different, where like it's not about the specific goals of fat loss or flexibility or something like that, where it's more like there's all sorts of other reasons to do this. And so like when I was doing Brazilian capoeira, like I was fortunate enough to have a teacher here in Colorado, here in Boulder, that was linked in with, you know, Mestre Cordion, the guy who brought capoeira to the United States. You know, he's a like world-class rock star in the art form, super deep lineage, you know, culture. And I was doing that 5-6 days a week, you know? Yeah. Like, and it was kind of you're all in or you're out kind of thing. I was, you know, teaching classes here in Boulder. I was traveling around to different cities, you know, to participate in events with different communities. And that was everything. That was that. And it was awesome. You know, it totally took care of, you know, getting my emotions and my embodiment in line, my flexibility. The problem was I wasn't mature enough to take care of myself on a certain level. So after 2 surgeries, you know, a knee surgery and a shoulder surgery, I had to tap out. Also, like, you know, breaking up with my girlfriend who was in the group and realizing it's like, I need to take a break from my teacher, from my girlfriend, and I need to like let my body heal up. And, you know, I had to pop out.
Yeah, and I feel like our first embodied practice, and listeners may be pre that, they may be mid this, or many may be past it, is like a kind of first love. It's a little bit psychotic. There's a lot of shadow involved. There's a lot of lack of discernment, often a lack of self-care. You know, if I think of my Aikido practice, I was really damaging myself at certain dojos particularly, and I was sacrificing things that maybe were unreasonable. And I remember at one point my university friends saying, you know, it's someone's birthday, like a really good friend, and they're like, "Mark, man, come to the party." I was like, "No, can do, Thursday night, Aikido." And they were like, "Dude, this is one of your best friends. Just fucking miss the night. It's not the end of the world." And I think in that instance, I actually made the right call. And it was like one of 2 classes I missed that year. And it was, you there was a certain unhealthy degree of obsession. And part of me feels like that's okay and that's kind of necessary. That's the sort of first love dive into embodiment.
Yeah. And also it's like, it's a healthy addiction, people are under the illusion that addictions you can just solve and go away, but no, you have to trade one addiction for another. And like really good ones, like a solid, Lineage with a mentor that's looking out for you and all these things. It's a great thing to get addicted to as long as we're watching the impact on the rest of our ecosystem and being able to make discernment choices like you made there.
Yeah, and I kind of, in some ways, I almost longingly look back on that. If I see someone getting into yoga for the first time, or, some of the sort of younger members of my own, embodied facilitator course community, it's like their first love. And I'm like, wow, that's so great. I almost wish I was back there, because there's a sort of full and easy, non-cynical, fully engaged kind of beauty to it. And then another part of me is like, going, okay, but be careful not to drink the Kool-Aid, guys. And I've had a couple of students that have had to, after a few years of working with me, almost like had to dislike me and go against me. And I did some little thing that upset them and it became a big deal. And I kind of went, okay, maybe they need to fall in love right now, and that's okay. And the door's still open to those people. And some of them actually have come back, but it's like, it just feels like there's both a longing for that return to innocence and knowing it's impossible. Because once you've had the disappointment, the spiritual teacher disappointment, the practice disappointment, I realized Aikido wasn't the sort of great martial art it said it was, or, you see the capoeira teacher abusing the students or whatever it is. And then there's no coming back from that.
Yeah, well, it's certainly a bit of a fall from innocence there, when we really think something is a panacea and it's going to solve all of our problems. And then when we see that it's merely human, it's a good rite of passage that I think people need to go through. But one of the things I tracking in our conversation here is this idea of like drinking the Kool-Aid, going all in on one practice, where it feels like it's all or nothing, where I really have to just put everything else on hold, which is very challenging for the day and age that we're in, where people are more, I don't know how much it is in Great Britain, but like in the United States, it's very materialist. We grew up going to Disney World and Six Flags and like eating at the buffet. Like, I want to try something out, here and there. And so actually having the discipline to go into like a rigorous tradition is hard.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. It's like, what is this day's version of like being able to cultivate something in a deep, life-changing way, but that is ecologically appropriate for balancing the rest of our lives?
Yeah. And the embodied buffet, it's like this sweet shop idea of pick and mix they have in the UK, where you go in and you sort of pick one of lots of different kinds of candies. And I remember one of my Aikido teachers, he's from the West Midlands, which is a very sort of working class kind of car manufacturing, kind of like Detroit kind of area. And a lot of good Aikidos come out of this area, and there's historical reasons for that. But I remember speaking to my teacher there about it. I said, why do you think there's so many more good Aikidoka in Birmingham than London, given that Birmingham's less than a quarter of the size? It's like the second biggest city, but there's a big drop off after London. And he said, well, because in London, people always come in and out of London. And in Birmingham, people live there their whole lives. And he said, and in London, there's a lot of exciting things to do. And in Birmingham, there isn't that much to do. Well, there certainly wasn't in the 60s and 70s when the original teachers were sort of getting the bug. And he just said, a lot of it came down to the fact that they were able to commit because there was not much else to do. And he said he kind of wondered in the modern age. He said it's fantastic. The modern age is so many cool things to do, but does that lead to less committed students? And part of me thinks it does, like it's just a symptom of modern times. And part of me thinks actually I still see some kids kind of, it's like they pick something and fall in love,
Yeah, and I think, we're I haven't lost faith in our culture. It certainly was disappointing, running the Integral Center, and we had like a meditation community, like holding space twice a day in the meditation temple, and nobody would show up for it. It's just like, no, that's too hard to have like some discipline around something. People, want to, get their kicks now and like feel good. And they're kind of like start complaining if everything doesn't feel good. And that was, had me breed a lot of cynicism. But at the same time, you see someone like Jordan Peterson emerge on the scene. He's the psychology professor from, Toronto.
Oh yeah, very familiar with him. Yeah, he's been a big influence on me. And I saw on your your LinkedIn profile that you cleaning up your room.
Yeah, exactly. And so, he emerges and basically says like, no, discipline is a thing you want. And like, starts bringing all these values in that haven't been given some attention in a long time. And a huge army of people show up, thanking God that he's shown up. So I think a lot of people want discipline, whether they know it or not. And it often takes an inspiring teacher or friends that you can see the change happening in their life. And you start to be like, oh, the hedonistic, just kind of doing what feels good because, oh, I'm all about the present moment, starts to, wear off.
Yeah. And I feel like the kind of 60s, it was all kind of like in the 70s, kind of like feel good, follow your bliss. And, if it doesn't feel good, it's not good for you. And there was a real turn towards the kind of permissiveness of the political left, which was really needed after the kind of 40s and 50s. And then that kind of gradually got institutionalized and integrated. So all the kind of major educational establishments and entertainment establishments became kind of completely bought over to that kind of permissive way of looking at things. It's like the Statue of Liberty won and the Statue of Responsibility doesn't exist. And
yep.
And then recent times, I've seen a turn back towards that. And people like Jordan Peterson almost kind of sound surprised when they're saying, discipline and structure your life and get your own self together, take personal responsibility, which has always been a big part of personal growth. But, that it seems like there's a turn towards that in the modern world.
Yeah. And, for me, it always makes sense that the West is still fairly young. Now, Europe has a lot more, I can project on y'all and say, you have more maturity with age and history, where I see the United States as relatively immature, that like we don't have traditions in the United States. We don't have lineage masters, with practices that have been handed down to us that came from the United States. Unless you're talking to like the Native Americans, and that's completely different. Or we're just like at the buffet, like we were talking about, whether it's like, oh yeah, well, Keith Martin Smith is a Kung Fu teacher, and he was attached to a lineage. And so which other culture am I trying to assimilate here? But none of it really has an appropriate functional fit yet for this modern, world that we're living in. So people are erring on one side or the other. Are they erring too much on the discipline side? Are they erring too much on the liberty side? And great, there's a lot of education in that. But what is the practice? What is the culture of development for this age that we're living in?
Yeah, and I sometimes I see America as kind of a teenager, and then I do see a bit of an obsession with kind of lineage and tradition coming from America to sort of fill this gaping hole. Though it's not like Europe has loads of its own lineages. I mean, we have a kind of pagan tradition that a lot of people in the UK who are into alternative stuff are into, but I'm not sure how genuinely unbroken a lot of that lineage is. It's been kind of reinvented a little bit. And I see all over the place, but maybe slightly more in the US, this kind of grabbing on to other cultures, the old sticking feathers up your ass to pretend you're a chicken, like people who think they're Native American or people who think they're Japanese samurai or whatever. Like I do see quite a bit of that all over the place, the kind of grasping after other cultures as somehow more spiritual. As Stuart Davis, who I think is a mutual friend, kind of made a joke about how one's own spiritual traditions are oppressive, but other cultures are spiritual.
Always. Yeah, which is kind of different from how natural human development happens, where it's like, you look at the other culture, typically that's the evil tyrant. Those are the barbarians that are trying to invade us. We have our beloved leaders where that's, traditional, but these days it's the opposite.
It's weird. I wonder if it's a sort of self-hatred that comes from all the colonializing countries. So France, UK, Spain, and then America. Like, because our cultures are, and I'm part Irish, so I've got a semi-get out clause, but there's cultures founded on kind of invasion and genocide. And I wonder if there's a sort of post-colonial guilt that doesn't acknowledge, and we see this in a kind of postmodern culture generally, it doesn't not acknowledge the beauty of Western cultures, or, even Western practices like therapeutic practices, for example, or improv or theater. There's many Western embodied practices, and somehow has a kind of weird self-hatred going on. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Definitely. And I think that's a big part of it. And I think a big part of it is more simple in that we just have too much time on our hands. That the Enlightenment, scientific progress of modernity has solved so many problems that now we have abundance. And we're sitting around in a place where we can afford to be recording conversations about embodiment when our ancestors had to survive through the winter, and in the warmer days they're growing their food and all of those things, and basically investing their energy into surviving. And now it's okay, survival has some relative guarantees to it. Okay, what problem to solve now? Oh, well, clearly the patriarchy, we have to solve that. That's a problem. That's oppressing me. When it's just find something to get your hands busy with during the day, and you won't be blaming so many other people making up problems for things that are happening in the world, feeling guilty about what our culture has done when pretty much all people throughout history, are have oppressed others.
Well, I had a great one today. So I was doing some. My lunchtime viewing was about Liberian genocide, because I'm strange that way, and I've had interest in West Africa for a while. I've been out there, and so Liberia was a country founded by American slaves who were freed, and some of the slaves went back to West Africa to start their own country, which was Monrovia and Liberia. The first thing they did when they got back to Africa was
that
they enslaved the locals.
Of course.
And it's there hasn't been a culture without slavery, just to use that example that America's always whipping itself for. But you're not special. The Aztecs had slavery, all the African kingdoms had slavery, the Asian, the Japanese had slavery. You're not the only civilization in the world that had slavery. What you were was one of the first ones to get rid of it. So it's I think there's some sort of pride in that. So that kind of, and I can almost see people writing the angry emails now, and it's no, guys, I'm not pro-slavery. I'm just saying that this is something that was culturally endemic, and then Western culture was one of the only ones in human history, if not the first, that said, actually, maybe we shouldn't treat each other this way. Maybe we can do better than this.
That's right. And, I think it doesn't take a whole lot of research to see these things. And I don't know if you've seen Steven Pinker's new book that came out this year, Enlightenment Now, which is basically an amazing essay on all the progress that has been made by our culture thanks to modernity. All the lives that we've saved, but it's really hard for the postmodern mind to wrestle with. Oh, actually, the environment has been getting better since the late '60s.
Yeah,
when there's people raging against climate change and all these things, where it's just no, actually progress is working. So it makes us check ourselves to be well, why are we complaining so much? Well, one, media has to work better to get our attention. So they have to make up more sensational stuff. And so they keep telling us about how the world's going to hell in a handbasket, which is just wrong. And two, it's simply very hard to be at peace with oneself about the blessings that we have. Actually receive that things are okay without doing the faux altruistic thing of no, I've got to make sure I'm solving problems to feel good about myself, because it's not okay that I'm white and have abundance.
Yeah, I feel like gratitude is the missing emotion of the left in a big way. I don't see that kind of gratitude for what's come before and where we are now, instead of replacing that with kind of guilt. But anyway, so let's talk about postmodernism a little bit, because Jordan Peterson's made this word famous. I've been studying this area since I was literally 16 years old. It's been a strong interest of mine. And some of the things like spiritual materialism you kind of referred to would be kind of part of this. So maybe you could briefly define kind of modernism and postmodernism, particularly in relation to embodied practice.
Yeah, sure. So, modernism pretty simply is where science came online, where we figured out how to come across objective truth through experimentation, empiricism, right? If I try this thing, let me watch the results of it.
Yeah.
And then the results are positive, and the results are positive for you too, then boom, we have something that we can rely on. it's pretty much as simple as that. But of course, a tremendous amount of cognitive complexity. It took society a long time to evolve the ability to do that. It's an amazing, awesome thing that happened to the world. And that's why it's called Enlightenment.
Yeah, I think one of the, I was in Florence not long ago and I just loved it. And it was one of the homes of the Enlightenment. And I still don't see the Enlightenment having touched all areas, whether that's Midwestern schools that are kind of, arguing about evolution, or whether it's a yoga class where, we told there's only one way to do things because the teacher says, and that's the way it is. Those Enlightenment ideals are kind of far from everywhere. And actually, we take them for granted. Like, there's people say they don't believe in, say, science or evidence. I say, so if you're in a court of law, would you like there to be evidence to prosecute you? And they say, well, of course. And I said, okay, then you believe in modernity. This is actually a given.
Right. And there's so many rabbit holes we can go down here. But science works. It has its own reform built into it. We don't need to worry about science. We just get good at it and think rationally. Those are the virtues that modernity gave us. But unfortunately, like all things, there's dignities and disasters. And the disasters of modernity can encourage people to reduce everything to what's objective, what can be measured. So all of a sudden, more subjective things like religious faith, feelings, psychology, modernity looks at that. It's no, those were the things that enslaved us, until we got here. That's the church telling us the way the world works and taking all the power. So we need to get away from that. Modernity is wrong. It's throwing the fairies and the nymphs out of our fairy tales and forcing us to poison our rivers and, all the liberal, songs to sing about that, which then encouraged the cognitive development into postmodernism, which is characterized by a flip away from objective thinking into more intersubjective, everything is relative. And
well, it depends is always the answer from postmodernism. And let's maybe speak to the positives here, because, for example, in embodied practice, that can lead to a more somatic feeling practice, a less mechanical practice, an emphasis on emotionality, on individual creativity, but also on communal kind of being togetherness. We've all done the hippie festivals where everyone holds hand and eye gazes and sings and, hopes it's going to change the world, which it never does, but it's nice. It feels good. And it's all about the feeling, right? It's all about how I feel rather than the logic. This is why there's a guy called Paul Linden, who's one of my teachers. He did a podcast on logic and rationality. And it just leaves a lot of people from this kind of worldview kind of cold, because they're like, yeah, but what about the subjectivity and the feeling? He's like, well, let's prove stuff, I just also want to point listeners, we're basically talking about developmental psychology, and I want to point listeners to the podcast with Keith Martin Smith, where we discuss this with lots of swearing, and a more civilized version with Benza Ganti as well, and other previous podcasts. So we're kind of talking about what's called developmental psychology as we do this. Yeah. So what, in terms of with the body particularly then, this kind of postmodern, very subjective sense, speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, so just, adding an extra punch to what you just said, this stuff can get really geeky and philosophical, but I encourage you to bring some rigor to this as well, because it's incredibly relevant right now. And getting intimate with this distinctions between the achievement modern worldview and the postmodern relativist worldview and et cetera is so useful, because everyone you're in conversation is going to be coming from these worldviews in one way, shape, or form. And I also appreciate you speaking to the virtues of postmodernism first, because, teachers like Jordan and even, Ken Wilber was infamous for this, of just pointing out the disasters of it, that the virtues of coming more into a relationship with my subjective experience and feelings and, of course, becoming context aware. And the Eastern teachers, when they say enlightenment, as in I awaken, I become enlightened. Yeah. This is what I'm talking about. Is I become awake to the stories I've been telling myself. And when I do that, it's like taking the red pill from the Matrix. All of a sudden, there's a power of freedom and choice and liberation. Yeah. And so with embodiment practices, it's no longer about looking sexy so the opposite sex will be attracted to me. It's about taking care of my body and taking care of our culture and like getting into the deeper things. And so, you know, a yoga class isn't all about physical fitness. It's about what is coming up as I move into this part of my body that I can get into relationship, you know, more deeply with.
Yes, there's increasing perspective, isn't there? Increasing complexity, increasing ability to abstract, to stand outside it, but also the body's coming online again as not just as an object, but embodiment proper is coming online at this point. I mean, we owe embodiment to the postmodern, conscious embodiment, at least to the postmodern worldview.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. It's the good stuff. It's the peak of, you know, what we would call first tier in developmental psychology, according to some. But it's like it's the good stuff. It's like the hokey pokey. It's what it's all about, and that's why when we opened the Integral Center, it's like focusing on more intersubjective practices, relational practices, is what gave us our market share. Like that's where we started attracting people, because that's what people want. People want to remember that life is worth living and to be re-enchanted, and having a simple connection with another or even myself and my body. It's easy. It's right there. I can be re-enchanted that life is worth living, to be inspired.
Yeah.
And
the re-enchantment is a nice. We had a guy from Australia talk about re-enchantment, but that's kind of what happens. You know, when the machine stops being a machine and starts being the magic comes in a little bit again. Let's talk about the Integral Center. So I want to relate this back to what you were talking about earlier, that we actually have all this choice in the modern world, and it goes for embodiment practices or anything else. And given that we have all this choice, that we need some way of making sense of all that choice. Some way of saying, okay, what do I need to work on in the case of embodiment? Like what is specific? Where am I missing something? Where can I grow? And so we need a model for that. And for me, Integral, Ken Wilber, the kind of main founder, but, you know, it's associated with other people, plenty of other people, Benzer, who we had on the show in Europe, for example. You know, it's this theory of everything, this idea that if we have a meta model, and there's lots of ways this could be interesting, but one for embodiment people is, okay, now I've got some kind of framework to see where my practices come from, where they're strong and where they're not so strong, and where I might be kind of missing a piece. Is that kind of fair kind of way into the integral model?
Yeah, no, I think that's really great, because that's speaking to the practical aspects of it, of how it shows up when we start thinking from an integral viewpoint. Let me do my best to summarize like how we get there developmentally of like, you know, yes, postmodernism is awesome for getting us back into relationship with subjectivity and enchantment, becoming context aware, seeing the stories that we're enrolling ourselves and others into. But we could go on and on about the dark side of it, of being overly relativistic, where it becomes a huge abdication of responsibility, where all of a sudden I don't have to enroll myself in any story. I don't have to have discipline because, hey, life is great and enchanting just sitting on my butt all day long. And I can start to see, y'all are all oppressing each other and me by telling me to pay my taxes or to compete and to achieve more, blah, 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 blah. We can go on and on about the disasters of postmodernity. But I say it now to say that the pain of postmodernity is what encouraged the integral level of development to come online. Because basically it's like, okay, postmodern's great, but I can't pay my bills anymore. What the hell? I can't get off the couch.
So many of my students have come to me, and it's interesting, the embodiment world, I think, was lead edge in many ways here. There was a group of people going, well, you know, now it's coming into mainstream culture as postmodernism has got more actual power. There's a more mainstream, like Jordan Peterson, kickback against it. But just in the embodiment world, this happened a while back. You know, what's happening with Peterson now and the kind of politically correct stuff was happening in embodiment 10 years ago, where people were going, embodiment teachers were coming to me and saying, hey, Mark, how do I make sense of this complexity? And it can't all be relative. And surely we need some standards. And can I reintegrate some tradition and evidence base into this feeling somatic approach they have now? And also just personally, people coming to me and saying, I'm broke. I need to earn a good living. Like I did a course called Purpose Black Belt, and it had a whole month on marketing in it. And it was like marketing for people that hate marketing, you know? And so for me, like integral, as not specific to the kind of Ken Wilber movement, but that stage of development generally, was trying to solve a set of problems that were just coming up amongst me and all my friends who were kind of deep in that postmodern kind of embodied practice.
Yeah, totally. And so it's really the big leap of consciousness coming into this, because all of a sudden I have access to all the different worldviews. Instead of blaming modernity for poisoning the world, I am actually like, oh, achievement could be good, because as groovy as my contact improv classes have been, where I can like disidentify with the masculine oppression and just kind of float around the room and feel the sensations in my body, how awesome that is. I've got 25% body fat index, and like unfortunately the opposite sex isn't that attracted to just my laissez-faire attitude about the world, even if they think they are.
Yeah, I definitely see that. I see the big drivers I see for people. One are like a directionlessness, like lacking that kind of masculine purpose, that kind of can lead people towards integral. And I see Peterson talking to that a lot. And another one is being unattractive. Is just kind of particularly for guys. It's just like, yeah. Although I hear it from women too. Women saying, what, I've kind of got a bit butch. I've lost my kind of feminine. And yeah. There's a kind of informed feminine on the other side of it, and an informed masculine on the other side of that kind of hippie thing, which is just way more attractive. If I hope she won't mind, I use Brooke McNamara as an example. She's just radiant, and she's married to a mate of mine, so I'm saying that with all respect. And it's she's just a radiant woman and doesn't lack strength or clarity or having her shit together in any way. And that's a kind of integration. And the other one I said was money, just people being broke and being unsuccessful in the world. Like let me be brutal, being losers, Robert. And that brutality of them going, what? I remember a yoga teacher friend of mine came to me a few years ago and said, Mark, I've got a kid now. I want to pay the bills, but I love yoga and meditation. How can I make this work? And he was just like ready for integral at that point.
Totally. Yeah, it's water in the desert for people that didn't even know they were dying of thirst, because it's even worse than being a loser. You're oblivious to being a loser, because in the postmodern worldview, you don't believe in winning or losing anymore. You deconstructed.
Yeah, I think part of them still does. I think part of them still does.
Yeah, your dopamine circuits still remember winning and losing because they live on that, but I'm telling myself the story that winning and losing isn't important, which makes it totally easy for me to be a hedonistic loser without me even knowing I'm a hedonistic loser, except that my body's suffering from it.
Yeah, and I just draw so much hate and shadow from that group of people that I know a part of them wants what I've got. Do you know what I mean? I know a part of them goes, well, hang on a minute, this guy's like quite successful and he's got a beautiful wife and he's got a career and I want a piece of that, but I don't really. And then they kind of cover it up in this weird way, and then the shit comes my way. So
the shit will come our way on this stuff, but I've had to give a lot of patience, to like, we don't need these folks to be, integral thinkers or anything like that. Like, there's a lot of beauty to postmodernism. People like take your time going through the flowery hills and meadows of enjoying that freedom. But eventually, you're likely, unless you're just living off a trust fund, you're likely going to get to a place where you see, the traditions are the traditions for a reason. They've been around a lot longer for a reason. This whole new paradigm thing that I've been enrolling myself in actually doesn't have a whole lot of validity to it. Yeah. It never seemed to happen. And let me check out the traditions. All of a sudden I realized I was starving. I realized I was dying of thirst. And so integral and like the teachings that you're doing and a lot of these meta maps, which give us access to the things that have been working throughout history, are like, oh my God, I can't believe it's humbling. I can't believe I threw all this baby out with the bathwater when like this is my birthright to inherit all that my culture has given me.
Yeah, I think there's a conservative case, and I'm talking about not descending to a kind of fundamentalist way of doing, but ascending to a more integral way of doing things, which is that if you look at a human, like a biological organism, and you just take a piece of their anatomy out, it's probably going to hurt them. Now, unless it's their appendix and you do it properly, which is a pretty unusual exception to this, pretty much anything you take out is going to fuck them up. And that's the conservative reason for why we might not want to just reinvent everything, change everything. And it's like, okay, is that piece of the tradition essential? Maybe I don't have to use Japanese. Maybe I don't have to use Tibetan. But I've got to be a bit careful with that, because that could be an essential organ of the practice that I just haven't realized is an organ yet.
That's exactly right. And I found myself on this, I'm not that old, I'm 38, but nevertheless, I'm in a place where I'm much less prone to throw things out when I'm, doing rigorous work in a tradition where I'm like, why do they do it this way? I know 100 different ways to do this more efficient and people get better. Yeah. And just putting that aside and being like, so many times, 3 years later, it's like, oh, that's why they do it that way.
Yeah. There's a little bit of trust that can come in, isn't it, when you don't hate your dad anymore,
Exactly. That's it.
There's a psychodynamic element as well as a developmental element. But I mean, like, for example, I also think you can step into these traditions in a different way. Like, I had a private one-to-one lesson with my Aikido teacher who's had 45 years of very traditional Aikido practice yesterday morning. Again, one of the other ways you can practice once you have a bit of money, doing things one-to-one. And I just was able to, we bowed to the picture of O-sensei, which is a part of the Aikido tradition. And we say onegaishimasu, which is Japanese. And I fully step into that with him. But at no point do I think that speaking Japanese makes me more spiritual, and I'm quite happy to let that go in a different environment the next day. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's a full stepping into it while not being attached to it.
Yeah, I think there's some good yoga that you can do around that. Like, I encourage some of my students to do the the national anthem, or say some of the prayers of the religion they were raised in. I was raised Catholic. So saying the Lord's Prayer, to see what happens when I step back into the fundamentalism of where I came from. And that's a good yoga practice of feeling what's there for me. Because if I get triggered around doing the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, then that's probably going to be undermining a lot of my efforts in the world, and certainly my conversations with others.
Well, exoticism always keeps a distance. I've had many lovers from other countries, because basically exotic is erotic, and it's also spiritually erotic. So it draws you in, whether it's the Japanese Aikido, the Indian yoga, or the beautiful Ukrainian girl. But then actually there's no real intimacy till you get past that, is what I've learned, both in intimate relationships and in practice. In the practices that I've got really intimate with, my long-term marriage to Aikido and yoga, for example, and my actual marriage, is that there's no real intimacy without that. And you have to reclaim your own culture. I actually have a little collage of Jesus pictures on my yoga space. And I have the traditional or Catholic one that I was raised with, but I also have the Monty Python Jesus and a few other kind of fun Jesus there. The scientifically reconstructed and analytical Jesus. It's a real integral Jesus shrine. But I have the traditional ones there, the Catholic ones and the stained glass ones. And, my wife freaks out about this because she's still kind of getting away from her kind of, that being forced on her in Orthodox religion. And, but what I've noticed is there's just a huge heart connection for me there. And even though people always say to me, I'm like, well, my mind belongs to Buddha, but my heart belongs to Jesus, And people could really mishear that, particularly in secular UK. I know some listeners are going to be like, what the fuck,
Totally. Yeah, I've had I love living in postmodern Boulder. I have a lot of scientist friends, just smart, rational people, because those are the only people I can hang out with, because they actually rigorously think.
Less annoying than the hippies.
Yeah, but the problem with them is they're disenchanted. They're atheists, and they're they've been like, oh, we're all atheists here. Isn't God ridiculous? And I was like, well, no, actually, I'm a theist, monotheist. And they're like, no, you're not. They can't
they believe it. Because you can only look down in terms of the level of development. You can't imagine it. I like saying God bless you to my friends like that. And I mean, in Europe, it's a bit different. In America, you have this strong atheist tradition that we, exported some of them to you. Dawkins and the like. And you have these kind of strong fundamentalist kind of Christians, whereas in England, most people aren't really like Christian. That's like weird to be Christian. And a lot of Europe's like that. It's pretty secular, most of Europe, you know. There's the Southern Europe's a bit more genuinely religious. And then there's a lot of people who are sort of spiritually orientated. We don't have quite the same kind of hardcore atheists, as it were, in most of Europe. I would say there isn't the same backlash against the kind of Bible Belt stuff. I mean, Russia and Eastern Europe's a bit different again, because there it is pretty hardcore. You know, in Poland, the Catholic Church says yoga's for the devil and things like that.
Yeah. So, you know, just dovetailing off of this point, I want to, like, in the theme of embodiment, like, the embodiment practice that I would say at this time in my life I've committed myself most to, and has been the most challenging one I've ever worked with, and the one that I teach about and recommend the most for those that have the courage. And it is getting into relationship with where we came from. Specifically, if you have access to it, family of origin, right? Like if your parents like are still alive, still in your life in any way, shape, or form, siblings, you know, something where you came from, like that practice for me has always been the hardest, because I got out of home as fast as I could, tried to get away, and then realized I was just running away. And now, through years of rigor, dragging my ass back home for the holidays and watching myself fail over and over again.
Robert, like, can I just check? Do you have another 20 minutes? I don't want to be kind of super postmodern and splurge over, but I love to sort of keep talking. Is that good with your time frame?
Yeah. I'm good with that.
Okay, so recommendations to listeners: buy the flag of your country, put it up in your house, sing the national anthem, go home for Christmas or Thanksgiving if you're a colonial, buy some Jesus pictures. You know, I remember once I put on Facebook, "I love Britain," and just those 3 words triggered the shit out of so many of my friends.
So many people.
And I was like, of course, you know, this is where I come from. I love Ireland. I love other countries. I love Japanese culture. I don't just love Britain, but of course I love Britain. And, you know, I just recently went to scatter my dad's ashes a year after he died with my sister in right next to the house where he grew up. And it was, my granddad was like an Irish immigrant, and he was the caretaker, which is like the janitor in this kind of posh school, a bit like Eton. And it was on a beautiful kind of hillside overlooking a river, and it was really relaxed, and it kind of felt like my dad. And then I kind of understood my class hatred a bit more because of the kind of nature of the situation my dad must have been in, like really seeing this school and being like, okay, how was it to be the son of the Irish janitor in the school? And I felt the town, the kind of embodiment of the town. I spent a day there with my sister. And it was profound in terms of understanding my own embodiment, you know? And certainly like spending time with parents and family and things like that is always profound.
Yes, that's it. And like, understanding the class warfare that lives inside you. And so like, I'm not just like calling this embodiment for the sake of the show, that for me, this is the most rigorous embodiment training I am, because like coming into my body with literal physical practice of like, whoa, I didn't even know I wasn't feeling everything happening in my gut. And that's a whole universe down there. Like that's one thing, but coming into where I come from is a return to my body, is a return to my greater body. And it's the hardest one, I think, certainly for me, and I can speak for a lot of people, that they just, it's just not available to them. If there's like too much trauma there. It's like when you're working with a client, you know, you're trying to get them back into their body, but there's just too much PTSD going on there. It's harder to work. And that, you know, it's such like strength training, where like training to failure. And like, I'm always like, okay, this time I'm going to show mom and dad how enlightened I am, and look how mature, I'm not going to lose my shit. And then just watch myself just get torn to shreds, because the people that know how to press my buttons better than anyone on earth.
Yeah, I was talking this with Ben about the necessity of therapy and the kind of Ram Dass story of coming home for Christmas. And I actually went out of a solitary week-long meditation retreat to my mum's 70th birthday a few years ago, because I was asked to do a speech. I said, okay, I'll leave the retreat and I'll come out. And she's there with all her ex-nun friends. My mum was a Catholic nun before she met my dad. And they're all just like Irish and taking the piss out of me, you know? And they're delightful, but at the same time, you know, it's that vicious Irish humor that's really part of my own character as well. And it was just a shock coming out of a solitary retreat into that. It was like, okay, the ultimate test, you know, like the family, you know, my military uncle's there and all my cousins are there. And, you know, my liberal kind of cousin has brought his 2 girlfriends and he's arguing with my conservative uncle or whatever. And it was like, wow. I mean, it's like being in the middle of my own psyche, which is a war zone right now, having done 7 days solitary before that.
Yeah. It takes courage. It takes like rigor. Like I went to my 20-year high school reunion a couple weeks ago in Atlanta, Georgia. And like, there was a lot of anxiety around that. And, you know, a lot of people don't show up for that kind of thing. And I understand why.
Yeah.
And I couldn't recommend it more highly. Like as far as the kind of therapy that I like for myself, this was so good. In every conversation, I got to see like the part of myself back then when I knew these people, right? And who I thought I was back then compared to who I think I am now, and the delta between those things. And it's just like, yeah, man, a lot of people don't have the stomach for it. But if you're courageous, if you're willing, go to those uncomfortable places, because the returns, the dividends of the relating practice there pays off more than anything else I've ever found. That's why I'm such a big proponent of that these days. And sorry, go ahead.
I'm going to recommend to listeners that they track down the boy or girl who rejected them at 12 years old, seduce them and fuck them thoroughly. I can highly recommend that as a practice. 20 years.
Stalk them for the next 10 years.
just the personal healing. I'm oversharing. Robert, so we really should ask about the Integral Center. I mean, that was going to be the main topic. So the Integral Center I went there to Boulder, and it was a bit of a mecca for me. You know, it was like I was in town, and I was like, wow, this is going to be so cool. I've heard there's this place where they do loads of integral shit. And, you know, Ken Wilber does talks there, and there's these great yoga teachers and great stuff going on. And, you know, it was a beautiful kind of converted church, really nice building. And I knew you ran it. I think we had a cup of coffee at the time because I'd been in contact online with a lot of people over the years. I'd kind of made friends online through the integral community. And I went there and I expected it to be like packed out full of people. And it just wasn't, man. I was in a class with like a world-class dance therapist with like 4 people. I went to a circling session that had like 5 people there. And I was thinking, my God, these guys have got such gold here and they still can't kind of bring the numbers in. So maybe you could say a little bit about how it got, you know, we don't have that much time, but how it got started and how it got finished. Because as I understand it, it's on the kind of wrap up stage now. It's 10 years after the event, right?
Yeah. I'm like, as you talk about this, I'm noticing, you know, a lot of like bittersweet feelings coming up because I'm sunsetting it right now. And I'm in a massive transition of myself, of moving on to who do I think I am going forward when I'm not, you know, the Integral Center guy.
You've been the man there for 10 years, right? Like you've been the Integral Center guy. Like I didn't know what else to introduce you as.
Exactly. Which, you know, it's like has all sorts of cool benefits to it, of like getting to meet awesome people like you just out of the blue, and like holding the space for all this. It's you know, the richest personal development path I've ever come across. But I also have 1,000 arrows in my back now, and like got such bitter cynicism about the world that, you know, it's going to take, hopefully won't take that long to get over. But it really, you know, this conversation has been good that we've been having here, because it leads up to this, of talking about how people struggle with, you know, reconciling between the freedom of postmodernism to be liberated, to feel what I feel, to feel good. But how do I yoke that with discipline, with integrity? And so with the Ken Wilber's work with Integral, there was a lot of conversations about how do we do that. So the concepts of like integral life practice, of like, you know, how do I have a balance between embodiment, spiritual, shadow psychological practices, and cognitive practices, and like see what I'm missing out there, and starting to offer things specifically to solve this problem. And so that was certainly where my mind was, what I cared about, trying to reconcile that in myself. And you know, I remember having a conversation with Rob MacNaughton, you know, Brooke's husband, an awesome teacher, and, you know, just us recognizing that the community didn't have roots. Well, like, where is the actual community? It should be in Boulder, but why? Where is it? Where does it live? And, you know, based on that, I also, you know, came across my business partner, Decker Kunov, in San Francisco, who was, you know, starting off doing like men's dating work, but like having the best kind of like
relating type practices that really scratch the itch of like feeling what it means to be alive right here, right now in a compelling way. Bringing that in and wanting to bring that explicitly for the integral community. And then this building became available. And it was really just one of those things that, synchronicities or whatever, it just all came together that allowed us to bring this in and to create a building specifically for this narrative of helping people reconcile these seemingly different worldviews and have practices that allow us to enact the world that we want to live in. And, all sorts of big, bright and shiny dreams. But as you said, it doesn't make it easier to run a business. Now, fortunately, we had these authentic relating circling practices that are unique. Well, maybe not so much now. We've trained up a half a dozen of our competitors worldwide.
I've been to some of the European ones. Some good friends of mine in Europe are trained in it. So to just briefly say what circling is then. So it's basically intersubjective meditation, right?
Yeah, I mean, like relational mindfulness. It's like, people sitting in a group having a conversation about what's happening here and now. What is it like here being with you? Which is a conversation people just don't have. And for good reasons. It's really easy to fuck it up. And most people don't get real, quote unquote, unless they're like getting fired or breaking up with their girlfriend, or something like that. Like getting real is a very, almost sacred thing that most people just haven't been trained in how to do. Yeah. And so this is a practice on how to do that in a skillful, way for the benefit of each other. And it's super simple. Like, just right now, it's like having this conversation with you, Mark. Like I'm noticing I'm passionate. I'm tapping into all these places that I really care about. Like having a brother in arms on all these things across the sea is inspiring. I feel energy about my life. Like that's what's happening for me in this moment now.
Yeah. So that being able to, and this is very much like a postmodern skill of being able to tune into like, so I'm talking to you and at the same time I'm noticing, okay, I'm also feeling warm about the connection. I'm a little concerned about kind of going over time. I'm kind of, there's a feeling of, oh shit, we haven't got through everything that could be really juicy here. There's a sort of intention about kind of looking you up next time I'm in the States. There's a whole load going on that I can track as an embodiment person who's, a certain developmental level relationally that's in the moment, which normally doesn't get noticed and definitely not fucking said if it gets noticed.
Totally. Yeah, typically people are so busy trying to, solve their lives and the world and deliver value. And I got to sound smart on this podcast recording when actually just authentically speaking what's happening for me right now is much more enlivening and interesting typically for people.
What? Listeners will, just to interrupt a little bit here, the listeners will hear this on the podcast. Guests who are tuned into now and to themselves and me, and when I'm tuned into the guest and myself, it sounds real different. We've had various speakers talk about improv and authenticity, like John Kramer and Rachel Blackman on the show. And but I just invite listeners to, like, as they listen to podcasts, notice where that's present and notice where it's kind of dead and not present.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and if we're going there right now, it's like you listening to this recording, like you are hearing our voices right now and you're having an experience. It feels like something. There's a quality to this conversation. And if I want to go all guru with it, I can say there's a reason you're listening to this recording right now. And your whole life has led up to this moment. And your whole rest of your life extends out from this place. And that's how a lot of
you Americans always make it so fucking significant. But I just offer listeners to notice how you're doing, as notice the embodied influence of Rob and I as we talk on you. Notice your responses. Notice if you're having like agreement or cynicism or humor or anger or whatever's coming up. Is like, I'd love listeners to make listening to an embodiment podcast an embodied experience, right? Like it's be kind of fucking silly if people were listening to this purely as a cognitive experience without noticing their own embodied responses to episodes. So. Yeah. And so what did you learn running the Integral Center? So it's been, 10 years?
Well, depending on how you measure it. So I started working for Ken Wilber 10 years ago. We started the Integral Center 7 years ago. And so, actually me running the show and being the CEO and kind of having my own big blank canvas. And we're talking about 14,000 square feet,
Yes,
old church in downtown Boulder, which was too much space, like,
that's
so
how I felt,
big takeaways. I'm a much more responsible business person, or at least I would like to think so, like going forward based on the errors that we made and like just not knowing how to reconcile, how to deal with all the energy and lack thereof. And so for one thing, seeing that like the average spiritual seeker in Boulder doesn't want to have a disciplined, embodiment or meditation practice, but they sure will pay a lot of money for doing like this authentic relating practice where they get to eye gaze with people they're attracted to, even though they're telling themselves they're not attracted to them, blah, 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 blah. Like that, like there's a market for this postmodern world. And it's an insidious swamp that will try to kill everything around it if it doesn't get its way all the time. So being a leader in a postmodern church, basically, like I have a lot of arrows in my back of people being like, simply who put you in charge? Oh, you're the white male patriarchy that's trying to oppress our evolution with your conservatism when I'm, trying to keep the doors open.
Yeah. You're just trying to fucking, pay yourself something like a living wage and pay the rent on the place. Like I know how hard that is. And I'm thinking of I will be starting an embodiment center in about 5 years. I'm currently about to do a sort of 5-year long, almost training retreat where I'm just kind of deepening my training for about 5 years. And then I want to start an embodiment center. And, I'm definitely going to be getting 5 years time, you're going to be getting a phone call from me saying, hey man, what did, let's talk about what you learn, what you do differently. Are there other things you do differently other than renting less space? I mean, is it just tuning into like what the market wants or particular speakers you definitely get more involved with? Or like, I'd love to hear a little bit more about this learning experience.
Yeah. So many things I could say here, but like simple things are like the obvious, being crystal clear about why we're doing it. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, we weren't able to articulate the vision of the Integral Center in a way that we could stand behind. And what that led to is a lot of people just projecting whatever they thought the Integral Center was on. Mm-hmm. And there not being a discernment principle around like, no, I get that you want that. That's great, but that's not us. Right. And people broken hearted. It's like, no, it's the Integral Center. You're supposed to include everything. And
like, you fucked yourself right there a little bit.
Exactly. So, obvious things like that, be clear on what you're doing if you're going to put a lot of energy into it. And frankly, being more exclusive, even elitist in a certain way of like curate the content, the programming, the teachers, the members, the people that are going to be in your community. Like, in business marketing, talk, we say like have your avatar of who your customer is. Well, in a certain sense, it's like, get really clear on who are the people you want in your community, as opposed to we were kind of like a doors open, if you want help, we'll try to help you. And like really trying to enact Ken Wilber's conveyor belt model of like, what can a truly integral religion spirituality do? Well, it can serve everybody in different ways. Well, that's like a 50-year plan. That's not something we can solve for now. Yeah. And so like, getting clear on what can we solve for now, that's really great. I mean, and like what I would do, we started with a faculty circle of, I found world-class teachers in Boulder who could fill a room on their own and, have them run events, to do brand protection, but we didn't foster that enough. We just were in over our heads with the amount of things we were doing, because what actually made the money were our weekend workshops training circling facilitators. That's where people would fly in from around the world.
It's funny that people will pay for a weekend workshop with a teacher and they'll fly in for a qualification for a little piece of paper saying they're a yoga teacher or a circling teacher, but they won't fucking come to a weekly practice which costs $5. You know what I mean? Totally. It's just weird. Totally. Like, I don't get it, but it's like, part of my business model is going to be like big deal American teachers doing weekend workshops, and I see the yoga studios only manage to keep their heads above water doing teacher trainings, which is ethically dubious because it's a kind of pyramid scheme. But, I think there's more ethical ways that are similar. So it's, it's interesting to me what was the reason for closing it then in the end? Was it just that it wasn't viable business wise? Did you want to move on? Like, what was the the reason you decided to shut up shop?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mark, because a lot of people, when they hear that the Integral Center is closing, they assume failure, or they get really bummed. They're like, oh, cruel world. They're taking our Integral Center away. Where for me, it's much more of a sweet thing of like accepting reality of like that. The business was actually thriving, like more profitable than it's ever been. And Jeff Salzman, who owns the building, wants to redevelop it. He didn't want to renew the lease. If I owned the building, I would do the same thing. That's what the neighborhood needs. That building is 70 years old now. It needs to go down. And there's so for me, the completion of the Integral Center project is a practice of letting go, of kicking people out of the nest in a certain sense, of being like, you've done your training. Now it's your turn. You can sit in the seat of leadership. Go enact the things that you think you could only get here. And so as soon as I looked around for a year for another space and wrote business models and looked for funding and blah, blah, blah. As soon as I made the decision to let it go, my whole life opened up.
That's part of purpose, isn't it? It's just listening to your own embodied reaction to things and listening to kind of how life opens up or doesn't without getting too kooky about it. I would push back on the fact that 70-year-old is a chance to, 70 years old is an old church. I'm dancing in a 1,000-year-old church tonight. So it's
totally different. I feel different. But it wasn't built that way,
Sure, it wasn't built with rocks to keep the Vikings out. Wow. And you know what, as well as if you had a 7-year relationship that was a really good relationship and it ended amicably, you wouldn't say that was a failure, would you?
Not at all, as opposed to one of the most rich experiences of my life, probably the most profound experience of my life until, whatever my career takes me to next. But the humility of the humbling of no, I wanted Boulder to have this lighthouse, to have something that grew roots, and the really hubristic visions of this is the new Catholic Church,
I'm going to be the first pope.
This is sustainable. This is every corner should have an Integral Center that represents the emerging needs of this world. Well, then the humbling of no, a dude had to die on the cross for the church we have today, and
a whole lot of dudes before the Romans fucking took it on.
Exactly.
Exactly.
And just
in terms of the future of the integral movement, I think that Ken Wilber's not got long. Let's be honest, he's kind of old, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens after he dies. And it's going to be, I'm not wishing that, of course. I wish him long life, but he's getting on. And it's going to be interesting. The Integral Center closing. Integral Europe seems to be blossoming. Benson's done a great job on the conference. 600 people or something booked into that. But I see Integral being born in other ways, like in Jordan Peterson's work. I see it popping up as postmodernism becomes more mainstream. I feel like the counterculture won't produce the reaction to it. I feel like mainstream culture there'll be these big reactions to it, like Jordan Peterson, which are going to be completely separate from this whole integral world.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And it's a breath of fresh air. Seeing Jordan, who doesn't come from the integral community, he quotes Jean Piaget, but he's not coming from typical Wilberian integral theory. It's no, this is a real thing. These thinkers are out here and they are serving people in a big way. This is only going to keep happening, and it really needs to keep happening because the postmodern insidiousness is only growing stronger. And so, to me, yes, I think, integral is going to emerge in its own beautiful, unique ways, but it does need people who have been there, who have gone through the slings and arrows of getting across the swamp of postmodernism to help each other out. So, people like you and the other people you have on your show, actually sourcing the leaders who are wait, am I crazy, or should we be reintegrating traditions? Absolutely not. Here's you're on the right track, and here are the things to watch out for.
Yeah, for me, this show is part of that integral swing, and trying to provide something beyond just pluralism in the specific embodiment space. Just to kind of go, I looked at the space and went, okay, that's a big enough world for me to try. I'm not Ken Wilber. this is a big enough space for me I think one of my strengths is how things fit together and integrating. So, someone in Holland said, "Oh, you're kind of like an embodiment, Ken," where I was like, whoa, hang on there. I've picked a kind of much smaller corner to work with. And even that feels like a life's work. But I feel like, this podcast is one of those contributions towards making this little corner of things integral. And you've mentioned arrows 3 times, so first of all, you privately send me the names and addresses of those people. I'm a much nastier man than you are. And secondly, at the sort of finishing party, I just invite you to kind of get your dick out and wave it at those people who have been throwing arrows at you, Rob, because I don't like to hear that with all the hard work you put in.
Thank you. I really appreciate that, Mark. And, it's like, once you have your Frank Visser emerge, like you're like the person who builds the career on taking you down, then you'll be the embodiment, Ken Wilber, and you can own that.
Oh, I've got hate groups already. I've got a feminist hate group in New York City. I've got my own hate group. So I knew I'd made it when I got my own hate group and one of my students got invited to it. I was so excited. It's such good marketing for me. It's really, I just want to say if anyone's out there for my hate groups, keep up the good work. I really appreciate the publicity.
Only makes the anti-fragile stronger. And so
there's the Nietzsche.
That's right.
I listen, enough of that. We need to go, man. We've been going on for ages. This is going to be one of the longest podcast episodes ever, but this is just super fun. So when you're finished, if you want to take a little vacation, you can come to Brighton and see how we do postmodernism, stay with me and Daria. And Brooke keeps threatening to get me out there for various things. So I'll probably see you in Boulder at some point next year. So final thing.
Yeah. Bring it.
Last message about the body, and before that, where can people find out more about you?
Yeah, good questions. And yeah, man, I would love to come out and visit there. And definitely, as you move towards creating your center, use what I've learned, and like I'd love to support that and happening. So last thing, for the body, I mean, I'm going to respond to this thing about the arrows of like, when you start stepping into your dignity and your leadership of the world, when you start actually helping other people, not because it feels good to stroke my ego or to get attention, like all those things are designed in our body for good reasons. Like the serotonin circuits, the dopamine circuits of winning, getting attention, having an ego that gets developed. Like evolution gave us those because it's in service of others. So as you're stepping out into the world and serving others, giving your unique gifts because people want them, those arrows come as a natural product of that. And it just shows you that you're helping people and that people wish they were helping people, but they don't know how to. So they got to take you down. And so welcome that. It does make you stronger. Even though the death of 1,000 cuts is a real thing, that's how postmodernism liberals take people down, is the death of 1,000 cuts. Mm-hmm. You are stronger than that. And I'm probably just reminding myself of this right now.
Well, if you need any help with that, man, let me know. Because as one of my school teachers said, I have flexible ethics. So it's been great. It's been great having you on the show, Robert. Really appreciated it. I'll link to the Integral Center's website there. And, you're probably going to need a job at some point, right? So should we be like advertising you to potential employers?
Definitely, man. I'm available to help right now. Like, certainly I'm kind of listening to the next thing, but like if anyone out there wants help with, developing a business for the postmodern world, that's my specialty, and particularly just, counseling people through this stuff. So consulting, coaching, anything like that, hit me up. Maybe I can help you out. Like my Facebook page, the Integral Center Facebook page, you're the first to hear about this. That this is soon going to turn into Integral Decentral, is the rebranding of that, and it's kind of a play on words of like, okay, we're out of the center, but now it's just me doing whatever I do in the world, and I'll be doing some recordings and various things on there. So feel free to subscribe to that Facebook page, and we'll have other ways to follow along that way.
Great, I will link to that as well on the notes. Sir, thank you so much. It's been really good to chat today.
Yeah, man, this is a pleasure. I love talking. I could do this anytime.
Pleasure.
If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to get more. If you'd like to help us build the Embodied Tribe, leave a review on iTunes or share this on your social media. If you're interested in training globally, sign up to receive the newsletter at embodiedfacilitator.com. Until next time, welcome home to the body.